Back to Road Gang Radio with Jimmy Mack, Lindsay Lawler.
Give me a minute, y'all. I'm coming.
And you, because if you're listening, you're in the gang. Take it away, founding member Phone Master Dre.
That I can sure do, because it is Thursday and it's feeling good from the good old house of Degas, a.k.a. what, Jimmy?
It's Fastport Studios here. It's Road Gang Radio. There you go, making the miracle happen. The Director of Legislative Affairs, Bryce Mongeon, is joining us this morning on Washington Trucking Week. By the way, not only is Bryce a member of OOIDA, he, in fact, is a music aficionado from the era of music that I grew up in, so he gets a pass on a lot of stuff. I'm just going to kind of cut him some slack on almost everything as he joins us this morning. We're going to be talking about two recent bills, by the way, the Non-Domiciled CDL Integrity Act, that's H.R. 5688, and Senator Lummis' legislation. Senator Lummis, of course, actually a genuine transportation expert out of Wyoming, called Connor's Law, which is S 2991. But first of all, Bryce, how you doing?
I have no complaints at all. How are you?
I broadcast from the middle of the city of New Orleans, in a canopy of oak trees on a 71-degree morning with no humidity. If I'm complaining, somebody ought to really just come over here and kick me in the ass. And since I've said that, Dre's looking at me. He's like, I'm on top of it. You just start complaining. Watch what happens next. How's it going? Let's talk about the Non-Domiciled CDL Integrity Act first. Let's just jump in the deep side.
Yes. And so this legislation, to cut right to it, if you like what Secretary Duffy announced last month on behalf of the Trump administration, then you will like and should support this legislation. Very simply, this bill would put into law the regulations that U.S. DOT announced last month. Basically, what they did was put a ton of restrictions on the use of non-domiciled CDLs and states' ability to issue those CDLs. As a refresher, basically up until last month, states could issue non-domiciled CDLs to anyone who came over the border and had a piece of paperwork that they collected when they did so. Last month, Trump administration said we've found a lot of problems with this. Surprise, surprise. They've said they've found states are not issuing these the right way. There's safety gaps in how these are being issued. So we're going to cut down on these tremendously. So now they're going to be limited to basically anyone. It's only people who have gone through the Department of Labor and Department of State and have paperwork that says you are permitted to do trucking, to have a job to drive truck in the trucking industry. So U.S. DOT estimated that would cut non-domiciled CDLs by about 98%. They said there's probably around 200,000 floating around right now, and this would bring it somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 to 5,000. So all but eliminating the program. And very simply, again, this legislation from Congressman Rouzer puts those provisions into law, which is very important because that will prevent some of the flip-flop between administrations, as we are all too well aware of. New president comes in and they decide to rewrite all the rules that they can. So by putting this into law, this legislation would really tie the hands of future administrations.
Well, and that's the other thing, too. It's one of the biggest complaints that I've had, both against Republican administrations and Democratic administrations, hasn't been against the administration. It's been with the members of the House of Representatives and the Senate not passing laws, because at the end of the day, the real power, and I know a lot of people would like, centralized power in the hands of one person kicking ass and taking names, but at the end of the day, the best way to kind of do this is make sure that one person, regardless of their party, can't come in and just be like, you know what, I'm going to change the rules again. If you write out what FMCSA or anybody else at transportation can and can't do, it doesn't become plenipotentiary. It becomes the will of the people, the people's house, and the U.S. Senate sits down and writes stuff that says this is what you can and can't do, and then the president and the executive branch are held to that, right?
Yes, absolutely. That's always one of our gripes is, when new administration comes in and, they say they'll be looking for data or reasons to support things, but ultimately, too often, I won't say all the time, I guess, but too often then that falls along, where you might guess on political lines. So it's encouraging to see Congress introduce legislation, Congressman Rouzer introduce legislation on this and hopefully act on this as part of the highway bill. But I'll also say, too, the issue of Congress trying to pass bills cuts both ways. Obviously, Congress, some members have some really harebrained ideas, but this is one of the more straightforward issues I think you'll ever come across. Again, we've always highlighted how this is a huge safety issue. If you have folks coming over who you can't verify their driving history, how do you make sure someone doesn't have a DWI or a fatal responsible for a fatal crash or something like that? So, we're not talking about some really specific controversial mandate. We're talking about something just making sure that we know and are sure of who the government and who states are going to give CDLs to.
Well, and this is, like I said, one of those great kind of civic moments, too, as well, because if the president and the administration want something the way they want it, they can go to Congress, make their appeal. Maybe their allies on the Hill can come up with something. In many ways, this is an attempt to kind of go along with that, the idea that the DOT is doing something, and there's enough, it seems like enough congressmen and congresswomen are willing to say, hey, we kind of like that idea. Let's codify that for you. And the other thing, I've always said that if people worry about harebrained congressional ideas, that's where the executive comes in. We have another word for harebrained. It's called veto. You know what I'm saying? You got to get a lot of people. You got to get a lot of people harebrained in order to kind of override the president's veto. You got to have a lot of now. Given the makeup of Congress, that's not always out of the question. But I get it. Can you talk about? And I know you've kind of given an overview. If in fact this law passes, what are the mechanisms in it? I mean, how does it kind of function? Does it lay out policy, or does it actually lay out process as well too?
Yeah, and so this is a little bit, I guess, another civics lesson. Don't want to get too into the details, but a lot of times this legislation and other bills, what they do is they direct the Department of Transportation to come up with regulations, and it's pretty specific in what it requires. Basically saying that states can only issue a commercial driver license to someone who's not a citizen or permanent resident if, again, they meet that criteria that I mentioned before. They've got some sort of eligible visa specific to driving truck. There's also it would require DOT to put in restrictions on how long a license can be valid. So they can't just issue a 5-year or 10-year license. It basically is only going to be good for the time that their work permit or work visa is good for. And it also makes sure that all the states are checking the boxes in terms of verifying that they have the visa, verifying that these people are providing accurate information. So, it is Congress very specifically telling U.S. DOT what to do.
Which, by the way, isn't always the case. Sometimes it's a generalized thing, and sometimes then the administration is able to kind of turn around and play real games with it. This really does specify it. In many ways, like I said, you made a good point at the beginning. If you are happy with what the DOT is doing right now, this codifies a lot of that policy.
Yep.
But it actually protects any administration in the sense that you can say, my hands are tied. That literally, it protects an administration in a way that, like, if other organizations want to bring pressure, too much lobbying is being done at the White House level and not enough at the congressional level. I know people hear me say that and go, "Are you out of your mind?" I'm like, no, I'm not out of my mind, because when you've only got to sway one person or one department to sway one person, it's very, very different than having to actually build a coalition to sway. We're basically herding cats is what we're talking about. It puts the heavy lifting back in the hands of the people that are supposed to be doing it in this country. All right, we're going to pivot here to Senator Lummis. And I kind of want you, for the people who don't know Senator Lummis, and a lot of people do from her exchange with the last administration, her and Pete Buttigieg kind of going back and forth in transportation issues, but kind of set up who she is, and then we'll talk about Connor's Law.
Yep, absolutely. And so, I hate correcting you, but Senator Lummis, she even puts her staff in her email.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
She's got it right. I have to laugh every time I correspond with her staff because they put it right there. Lummis like Hummus. So, Senator Lummis, she has been an advocate for truckers. She has previously been very supportive on truck parking legislation that we've worked on, dedicating funding to truck parking. We're still working with her office and working to get that legislation reintroduced this Congress and the Senate, especially with the highway bill coming up. We want to see that bill introduced again from her to again get it across the finish line as part of this big Super Bowl of trucking policy that's coming up. But regardless, she has talked consistently about the need to address truck parking in congressional hearings, as you mentioned, making sure that there's enough places for truckers to have a space to get some rest when they need it. So she knows owner operators, she knows small business truckers, and I understand from talking to her and her office, as well as other members of the Wyoming delegation, that, turning this English language proficiency issue, it's a big issue for her and a big issue for the state. So we were encouraged and excited to see her take up this issue because, again, like I said, she knows trucking, she knows our issues, so she knows that this is important, and she wants to make sure that this is done right.
Yeah, and so kind of talk about what this means. Let's kind of go through Connor's Law in detail and kind of talk about what it all kind of entails.
Yes, and so what this would do is require, basically, take the English language proficiency requirement and ensures that it is part of the CDL process, the credentialing and the training process. So we think this makes a ton of sense. It's not just taking people off the road once they've got their license without demonstrating English language proficiency. It's also making sure that these folks have the proficiency in the first place, so that you never get in a position where someone's going to be taken off the road. So again, bringing it back to safety, it's hard to argue with the idea that you should make sure that people are trained and are able to demonstrate all the necessary skills before they get their CDL. So we know there's a lot of legislation floating around on English language proficiency, non-domiciled CDLs, but again, it's a pretty straightforward idea that anyone who's getting their CDL needs to show they can, and reading from the bill, it's understand highway traffic signs and signals, respond to official inquiries, converse with the general public, very basic stuff. So that's the legislation that she's introduced, and it is a companion bill to legislation that was already introduced in the House from Congressman David Taylor from Ohio and Congresswoman Hageman from Wyoming. So as I said, there's been an interest in this issue from the Wyoming delegation, so we're glad to see her take the lead and put this out in the Senate.
In many ways, this is an idea that some folks, some members of OOIDA actually had, and this, if I'm understanding it correctly, it really attaches it to the beginning of the process. And one of the things that OOIDA, and by the way, a lot of our listeners have too as well, what is really great that's going on right now is that people are shifting their attention away from individual drivers, some of whom are just over their head, some of whom are bad actors, but some of whom are just over their head and often in a very, very difficult position. This is really kind of beginning to shift things to say, you need to look at who you're hiring. You need to look at who you're bringing on here. And if you're bringing on people so that you can undercut rates and put cheap drivers behind the wheel and people who you can put the muscle on and the elbow on, you're in the wrong business. And what this does, if I'm understanding correctly, it's saying, no, that it's actually making life easier on law enforcement because the simple act of having the CDL is in itself an imprimatur of being proficient in English and changes the way individual drivers are approached based on the issuance of CDLs moving forward. It's okay if I got that wrong. I just want to make sure I understand.
No, you are right. And you're absolutely right. And I think that's how we've also talked about this issue is, this is, certainly it's cracking down on drivers who don't have the skills and shouldn't be out on the road. But, it's hard to imagine, especially when you combine it with this non-domiciled CDL issue that's been going on. It's not as if these people kind of, or at least, not all of them are just finding their way here on their own and deciding to do all this on their own. There's people who are, frankly, taking advantage of them. And it's in some cases, it's not fair to them because they're being misled. They're being lied to. Like you said, they're not being paid the right way. And it's not fair to these folks as well to be put out on the road without the skills that they need. So it's putting these drivers in an unsafe position. So you're absolutely right that this is, in a lot of ways, focusing on or trying to cut down on those root issues that allow carriers and other people to take advantage of these drivers. Because, again, bringing it back, we don't want drivers to be placed out of service, on the side of the road because they're not proficient in English. That's not good for that driver either. So this is getting at those root causes and hitting back at some of those folks who are taking advantage of those drivers directly and ultimately undercutting and screwing over everybody else in the industry.
Yeah, and by the way, and I hate to kind of beat this horse, but I want to make this really clear. It's one thing to throw somebody either across the border back where they came from or to throw somebody into a jail cell or, to basically rip somebody off the road. Bravo, well done. But if the person who hired them gets to keep their big salary and gets a slap on the wrist and a fine, that doesn't solve the problem ultimately, because it means I can keep doing it. It's kind of like, oops, sorry, I won't do it again, and then they will. The law, by the way, is named after a young man named Connor, who in 2017, just 18 years old, during his freshman year of college at the University of North Florida, died in a car crash involving a truck driver who was distracted and could not understand English or read traffic warning signs, which, by the way, by doing that, by naming the bill that, what you're doing is you're calling to attention to the fact that, as you guys have stressed, an economic issue, yes, it will help insurance rates in the long term if it's widespread. It will actually take some drivers off the road and bring up rates a little bit in certain areas. The big thing is it creates a safer workspace for the people who are playing by the rules and doing it legitimately. And that's part of what is going on here, correct?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, from day one, we have talked about this as a safety issue, because that is the biggest issue. I mean, through and through, you need to be able to read road signs, converse with law enforcement, all that sort of stuff. It really is why we're focusing on this issue.
Okay. I'm going to at some point have to talk about process. I don't mean the process of enforcing the law. I mean the process of actually making the law. We've actually got to go back to our schoolhouse rock here now. Prospects. Let's talk about the fact that, Lummis is a player. Does have some gas in the tank, so is able to kind of move stuff. It does have some friends in the House. David Taylor introduced the same legislation in the U.S. House from Ohio. What are its prospects in regards to moving forward? Because, man, a couple of years ago, Louis Pugh and I were talking about it. He knew. He said, we're at the 5-yard line, but we're not in the end zone on truck parking. So a lot of stuff can get really down the field, but until it crosses the goal line, it is just a really good idea. What are you guys thinking here in regards to getting there?
Yeah, I think we are in a good position, about as good position as we are on any of the issues that we're working on. And that's because, in large part, the timing is good with the highway bill being written right now. As we've talked about before, the highway bill is where all the surface transportation policy is packed in together, including trucking policy. So it's not too often that bills move on their own, but this is the exact type of bill that would be packaged into a highway bill. So we feel good about this legislation. I will kind of qualify that a little bit by saying, I mentioned before, there's a couple different bills on English language proficiency that are floating around out there, and they all take a slightly different approach. And, we think that there's, the exact words or the exact language is going to be worked out in the final product. But I think what's important to highlight right now, too, is we've been working on this issue for a long time, especially heated up in the last few months. So we've been working with lawmakers, working with committee, and working with all the people involved to make sure that this is done right. So to put in a plug for ourselves is, we are keeping our members informed on this. Fightingfortruckers.com is where we've been updating folks on this legislation. And I will say it's really important to ensure that this policy is done right. This is a very hot topic right now, completely and understandably so. We are making it a hot topic as well, but we want to make sure that this is done right. So by working with lawmakers like Senator Lummis, like Congressman Rouzer, we can make sure that something actually gets across the finish line. So I think that's important to keep in mind as folks are listening and kind of trying to figure out what bill is moving and what's happening. Is there's a lot of moving parts, but ultimately we're making sure that we're talking about what we believe has the best chance to actually implement the best policy and actually get across the finish line and signed into law. Yeah,
and the other thing is, as you mentioned earlier on, the idea of, pass an individual bill, unless it's an actual national crisis. The only way you make it happen is by getting into that highway bill, which it's got, got some real friends. The question is friends in regards to bipartisan buy-in, man, because you get bipartisan buy-in, and it means that it doesn't get removed from the highway bill under any circumstances, because it means that there are people saying, look, I need some cover here. I got to give my folks back home something, and this is a good thing to give a lot of the guys and gals who drive trucks who live in my district. Do you guys feel like there's anybody that you can target on the other side of the aisle? Because there's a lot of R's attached to this stuff, and like I said, there's a like I said, one of the great things about what you guys are proposing here is that it's CDL certification attached is what we're talking about here. The big difference in that's an easier sale than actually what I call, interstate police force. Basically scaring the hell out of people. This is much better. Like, if you don't have that card, you're done here. If you don't have that car, we can't even have the conversation. Do you feel like there's some ability there to kind of, you haven't got to name any names, don't worry. But do you feel like there are people you can talk to?
I feel like, yes, we are talking to Democratic offices on this. And I feel like more than other issues, there's an opportunity for bipartisan support. I will say we don't expect a lot of pushback at a bare minimum. Because as you said, this is not looking to police people while they're out on the road, take people off the road, fine them, whatever else. It's simply making sure that they have the skills before they get their license and set out on the road. So this is especially the English language proficiency as part of training, is a very hard thing to oppose. And as we read the lay of the land right now, we certainly don't expect as much opposition as we have with kind of some more contentious mandates or things like that. So we feel like this is in a pretty good spot.
Yeah, there are a couple of populist folks on the other side who have no problem saying, "Oh, we're going to make sure that the people who actually usually profit from these people being behind the wheel don't get their pound of flesh." And that's kind of it's a much easier pitch and a much easier sale. Okay, so let's kind of talk about the rest of the agenda, because, like I said, there's that big list you guys have. Kind of give us an update on the overall status of where you guys are at on the Hill and what's going on in regards to all the. And like I said, both. Talking to our friends in the press, there are so many stories going on right now about legislation, about deregulation, about scaling stuff back, about amping stuff up. What are you guys looking at in the next couple of weeks that you've really got your eye on?
Yeah, I think that we're looking to also make some inroads on other issues related to this ELP and non-domiciled CDL stuff, because bringing it back to safety, we think there's a lot of other ways to improve safety, not just with this. And one of the things that we've talked about over and over again since for years now is improving other entry-level driver training standards, including a minimum number of behind-the-wheel hours before you can get your license. As I'm sure some folks remember, there was what's called the negotiated rulemaking for entry-level driver training standards, which is a fancy way of saying a group of almost 30 stakeholders came together and put together a proposal for CDL standards. 26 of 28 of the folks in that group endorsed the idea of just 30 hours behind the wheel, not a whole lot, less than a full work week. 30 hours behind the wheel before you can get your CDL. Unfortunately, there were two holdouts, one of them being ATA, and the final rule for driver standards for CDL standards did not include that minimum number of hours. So we'll be talking to folks, we have been already, but reiterating that if you want safe drivers, whether it's making sure they can, read and understand road signs, or making sure that you've got their driving history records, a very obvious component of that should be just a minimum of 30 hours before they're set free on the road. And I think, too, we're talking about that in conjunction with the legislation we just saw reintroduced to basically allow for under 21 drivers. There's been that push. There's a pilot program right now, which hasn't really gone anywhere. But there's a new bill that would put forward an apprenticeship program that would require 400 hours of training and work before you'd be allowed to work as a driver in long-haul trucking under 21 years old. We've always opposed that and will continue to, but we're kind of scratching our heads. So you're saying if someone's just under 21 years old, they've got to go through 400 hours of training, but second they turn 21, you don't need anything. So there's a lot, I think a very good conversation to be had right now about implementing a new minimum number of hours before you can get your CDL.
It's a pincer maneuver in some ways, because as the non-domiciled kind of get wound down, we'll call it that, the winding down of non-domiciled, as we begin to kind of do that. The zombie ideas always have a habit around Halloween of crawling themselves out of the cemetery and coming back to life. and it feels like you guys are bracing up, knowing that if, in fact, this world is sunsetting on, send somebody to a different state and load them up and move them out, that you guys are actually saying, okay, where's the next bunch of cheap rates coming from. And the concern there is that it might be 18-year-old drivers, that we may really revive that. And by the way, and full disclosure, we had on a young man who actually was part of that apprentice program. But I would encourage people to actually listen to that interview, by the way, because what he had to do to get there, you go, okay, well, that makes sense. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about, we'd like that program back, but we would like it back with none of the contingencies and none of the restrictions that one had on it. So you guys are really keeping your eye on that next move, aren't you? Just making sure that idea doesn't come roaring back to life, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And our biggest concern when you're talking about the under 21 drivers is this idea that you're going to set folks, they're free to drive anywhere across the country, not just terrain, not just hours, but being away from home for weeks at a time. It's just really hard to comprehend how that's really setting anyone up for success. Now, we've always said we're based in the Kansas City, Missouri area. We get those concerns if you're operating in the Kansas City region or here in the D.C., Maryland, Virginia region. If you're just doing some day trips or operating very regionally, we get how that can create some problems or some challenges. So if you want to give someone some experience, maybe give them some experience in a very limited area, allowing them to cross state lines, but not sending them across the country to, again, unfamiliar terrain, unfamiliar weather, an unfamiliar lifestyle. So we think there's ways to address some of the concerns that people have raised about the restriction on younger drivers in interstate trucking, without, as you said, just kind of opening it wide up to everyone to go anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, basically, here's the question. Are you guys really trying to, not you, but the people we're talking about here, are you trying to create the next generation of drivers, or are you just looking to, basically get a really big turnover and put meat in the seat, to get the next load where it needs to get at the cheapest possible rate you can manage for the bottom line? Bryce Mongeon has joined us this morning. You guys know him of OOIDA. Not as often as we'd like, but it's good to have you back. What are you listening to these days? What's the next big play on your playlist? What's going on?
I have been not to get completely off track with work, but there's a great podcast. It's a history of rock music and 500 songs that I've been listening through. That it's a
he's been
really
on the show.
Really interesting.
He's been on the show. He's been on this show.
You're kidding me?
No, I'm serious.
Man.
He's been on this show. He's good stuff.
He's wonderful. It's kind of spoiled other podcasts for me because it is such a good podcast. So that has been a lot of what I've been listening to and kind of branching out through there, kind of just listening through all that stuff. So that has been very enjoyable.
Yeah, really fun. I actually watched a reaction video just the other night of all these people under 30 listening to Simon and Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water for the first time, watching half these people burst into tears at the last part about Sail on Silver Girl. Thank you, Bryce. Great talking to you. Have the best of days.
Thank you. You too.
OOIDA.com. Fighting for truckers.